There's a saying called the unbalanced scale. This represents the right side and this represents the left side. So for most people, their pelvic floor muscles are currently in this state. The right side is higher and the left side is lower. What is this thing I'm showing you? This is called the anococcygeal ligament, which is the ligament between the anus and the coccyx. Why am I introducing this to you? It's this structure that divides your pelvic floor muscles into left and right halves. Through this, the pelvic floor muscles are separated into two sides. When you walk, the pelvic floor muscles on both sides can interact with each other. In other words, it serves as the dividing line between the left and right pelvic floor muscles. That's why yesterday I briefly mentioned something called a coccyx fracture. A coccyx fracture means that the dividing line, the boundary between the two sides no longer exists. So the left and right pelvic floor muscles can no longer be separated. As a result, it affects the strength of each leg individually, impacts gait, balance, pelvic floor muscles, and even breathing. This is the anococcygeal ligament. These are the external and internal anal sphincters. This is the central tendon of the perineum. Inside here is the urethra, and this is the urethral sphincter. The urethra and related structures are all here. This ligament connects the coccyx and the sacrum, and is called the superficial sacrococcygeal ligament. This is called the sacrococcygeal extension ligament, which helps fix your coccyx to the sacrum. So if your coccyx is fractured and the anococcygeal ligament here becomes loose or shifts to one side, what does that mean? If it shifts, it means that the pelvic floor muscles on both sides, which were originally separated in the middle, now become unevenly divided, like an apple cut unevenly. So for people whose coccyx tilts to one side, it definitely means that their sacroiliac joint has been misaligned for a long time, especially after a coccyx fracture. When these two ligaments are damaged, this one is called the sacrococcygeal extension ligament A, and this one is the superficial sacrococcygeal ligament. This one is the anococcygeal ligament. They are connected to the anococcygeal ligament and help stabilize it. In other words, you can think of them as helping to stabilize the pelvic floor muscles because they help tighten the anococcygeal ligament. The high-risk ligaments are responsible for the 3 openings at the front, and these 3 openings are all arranged along this midline. That's why I say, when the child suffers a coccyx fracture, as soon as the fracture is discovered, you should put on gloves, apply some oil, hook the coccyx, and have the child lean forward. This way you can reposition it. Then, make sure the child avoids jumping around for a couple of days. Once it gradually heals, the coccyx fracture won't affect the child. Especially in our generation, when we were young, our parents were busy working outside. So after we grew up, most of us ended up becoming my clients, suffering from back pain, hip pain, breathing problems, and sexual dysfunction. There are all sorts of problems. With a coccyx fracture, in the first 20 or 30 years, there may not be any obvious effects, nothing apparent. It does have an impact, but it's just not obvious. The biggest impact is on the pelvic floor muscles because this line serves as the dividing boundary, the Chu River and Han border of the pelvic floor muscles. This is called the falciform ligament. The falciform ligament is the dividing line between the left and right sides of the muscles. It splits the diaphragm into left and right parts and also divides the liver into left and right lobes. So you can think of it as being like a sickle, dividing the liver into 2 parts and the diaphragm into 2 parts. That's why it's called a falciform ligament. The ligament dividing the pelvic floor muscle is the anococcygeal ligament, while the one dividing the diaphragm into left and right is the falciform ligament. The right side of the falciform ligament belongs to the right diaphragm, the left side to the left diaphragm. Once these 2 ligaments are divided, that's why during gait, the 2 half circles shown on top and one on the bottom interact. The top forms a half circle, the bottom forms another half circle, and when they fit together, they make a full circle. So during walking, it's a symmetrical interaction of halves. Understanding the relationship between them is a bit complex, but you just need to know that this is how it works. Let me show you something else. This is the falciform ligament, and here I am with the teachers from our team. We made it very large in our dissection. It directly divides the diaphragm into 2 parts. This is the falciform ligament as shown in the anatomy software. It separates the diaphragm and the liver into left and right sections. Why am I showing you this? Because these 2 ligaments determine which half of your diaphragm cannot move upward and which half of your pelvic floor muscles cannot move upward, using it as the boundary. We refer to the left pelvic floor muscle as being on the left side of the high position ligament, which is called the left high tail pelvic floor ligament, and the right side is called the right pelvic floor muscle. The right side is called the right diaphragmatic falciform ligament, and the left side is called the left diaphragm. So their dividing line is based on this standard. Now that we've discussed this, you should actually already know which side of this person's pelvic floor muscle cannot move upward. But let me give you a suggestion. I know that the model I've been using these past 2 days has a left pelvic floor muscle that cannot move upward. If I simply train the left ilium by doing adduction and abduction exercises, moving the ilium to the anterior and posterior positions, will its function return to normal? Do you understand the question I'm asking? When we performed the Ober's test, the actual measurements of vital capacity and heart rate all pointed to his left ischium, and all the data matched up. The pelvic floor muscles on his left side definitely can't be lifted. So since his left side is already suspended forward, whether through manual techniques or muscle training, if I move his left ilium forward and backward, adduct his left ischium, and adduct his ilium, will its function return to normal? Will both sides then be able to interact with each other? Let me tell you, no matter how you adjust it, whether you use American chiropractic techniques, traditional Chinese bone setting methods, simply activate the left hamstring, or inhibit the left rectus femoris, any intervention you make will immediately change the data, but none of these interventions can maintain the effect for a long time. So any additional intervention we do is only affecting one part of the real issue. The formation of any phenomenon is the result of many conditions coming together. When you intervene in one of these conditions using your area of expertise, it will change the outcome and the result will shift accordingly. For example, if I activate its gluteus medius, or have it do a single leg deadlift with the left leg, its lung capacity will improve. If I have it walk supporting itself with the left ischium, the result will also change. If I have him sit on his left ischium alone for 5 minutes, his lung capacity will also improve while he's sitting on the left ischium. There are hundreds of ways I can make this kind of data change. For example, if I simply give a massage, I could just massage his right rectus femoris. If I loosen up the right sartorius, the right tensor fasciae latae, and the right psoas major, his data will also improve, his lung capacity will get better, and his heart rate will go down. But if I test him again tomorrow, it'll be the same as before. Or if I test him 3 days later, it won't work anymore because I only intervened in one of the conditions. What I'm telling you now applies to all schools of thought. Why does this happen? After intervening in just one condition through various tests, you've only identified which side of his pelvic floor muscles drops and can't come back up. But you don't actually know why this side drops in the first place. Do you know why the left side drops? It's because the left ilium is anteriorly rotated, abducted, and externally rotated. So why does the left ilium behave this way? It's because the body's center of gravity is shifted to the right, bearing weight on the right side. And why is the center of gravity on the right? This involves the diaphragm. So if you want the pelvic floor muscles to rise, you first need to relieve the pressure on them. If you want the diaphragm to move up, you need a strong upward force from below to push the diaphragm up and keep it there. Every part below needs to be able to maintain this upward force. After your diaphragm sinks down as you inhale, only then can it rise back up. But if when you inhale, the downward force is strong, but the upward push isn't enough, then the diaphragm will only keep getting lower and lower because the force pulling it down is greater than the force pushing it up. However, if at a certain point, like when you're lying down, you can push it back up. But once you sit up from lying down, your support area becomes smaller and you can't push it up anymore. So it turns out that when you're lying down, your diaphragm is higher, but when you sit up, it drops lower. This is why for most people who experience urinary leakage, the kind that happens when coughing isn't actually the most severe type. For most people with urinary leakage, it's rare to leak urine when coughing while lying down. Usually it happens when coughing standing. When lying down and coughing, there's no leakage. That's because when lying down, the diaphragm puts less pressure on the pelvic floor muscles and the pressure from internal organs is also less. The weight of the internal organs is directed toward the ground and not pressing down on the pelvic floor muscles. Once you understand this, you can connect it with what I said earlier about the diaphragm. If you want the pelvic floor muscles to lift up, you first need to avoid letting the diaphragm put too much pressure on them. And if you want the diaphragm to keep moving upward, your pelvic floor muscles need to continuously provide upward force. Only then is it possible for your diaphragm to rise. It's not about using your internal organs to push it up like a pear and expecting it to stay up there all the time. You need to breathe if it doesn't come down. How are you going to inhale? So as soon as you inhale, but you don't have the ability to push it back up, what do? I can teach you 88 different tricks that can instantly lift the sagging pelvic floor muscle. But these 88 tricks are only to prove to your clients in that moment that you have the ability to lift it up. However, that doesn't mean you actually have the ability to prevent your client's pelvic floor muscles from sagging again, but it doesn't affect your ability to sell classes. For example, if someone has urinary incontinence or hemorrhoids, you can use these methods to make them feel better right away, or at least not show symptoms in the gym in front of you. But when they go home, the problem comes back. This is something that can be done. These are tricks I've used in frontline practice for over 20 years, and there are plenty of them. However, what I pursue is whether there's a method that is both effective and long-lasting. At this point, you have to look for the root cause. What kind of cause are you looking for? For example, if the left side of the pelvic floor is sagging, the reason might be iliac abduction and external rotation, iliac abduction and external rotation. It could be that there's more pressure on the upper left side. Why is there more pressure on the upper left side? It could be because your right side is also stuck, so you can only put pressure on the right side. That's why in the afternoon, we'll start learning how to address left iliac anterior rotation, abduction, and the external rotation, and how to resolve a positive Bob test on the left side, but without actually moving the left side. We don't move it, the pelvis stays still. Let's see if there are other ways through the pelvic floor muscles to get the iliac bone on this side to return, to lift the pelvic floor muscles here. And after raising these up, find a way to reinforce and stabilize them. If you're capable, you can even get them to interact, and only then will the results last. That's all for the pelvic floor muscle assessment. These are the methods. So which one should you choose? You should select at least 3 or more tests. All the evidence must point to this side before you can conclude whether there's an issue with the pelvic floor muscles. What does 3 or more mean? For example, a positive left side obturator test. The left ischium is suspended in the Z sitting position. The left ischium is seated on the chair and the resting heart rate is high. The left ischium is seated on the chair and vital capacity is poor. Aren't all these signs indicating a larger left hip abduction angle on the left side and a positive Thomas test on the left? I've given you a bunch of options. When you're testing a member, you need to check at least 3. If all 3 tests match and point to the same side, you don't need to do the rest. You can skip the remaining tests. If you know that out of 3 tests, 2 are like this and 1 is like that, you need to choose more. For example, if you do 5 tests and 3 of them all point to this side, you can confirm that the problem is on this side. I'm just worried that your measurements might not be accurate because many students get a false negative when doing the Ober's test. For vital capacity, you need to have a tool ready. For heart rate, you need to have a device ready as well. You should prepare more of these kinds of tests so that your results can be more accurate. If you're not sure, then for the next 3 days, all the movements I teach you will be done in the wrong direction and you'll be doing them incorrectly. So no matter how precisely you perform the techniques later, it won't help. That's why this is like navigation. It guides you on which direction to go.